Hello everyone, my name is Illarion, and today I would like to share my experience working with Node.js in Docker containers with you. Shortly about me. I work in e-commerce mostly, and I'm a front-end engineer. I would call myself a principal engineer in my company, answering Krzysztof's question. A principal engineer means that I am able to start and finish the project from start to finish, or from the architecture to the actual implementation, and guide other developers in this process. How, like that? Better? Okay. Principal engineers do exist, and I would say my definition of a senior developer is the level of independence. Are you able to complete a complex project from start to finish by yourself? This would be my criteria for senior level. All right, back to Node.js. Around 5 years ago, it became clear that we no longer can work on front-end projects without Node. Compiling our JavaScript bundles, linting code, running tests, running things like Karma, Cypress, Puppeteer, whatever. Node.js has become an integral part of our development. So around 5 years ago, I was starting out just like everyone else. I was working on my Mac. I'm happy to have access to great machines like that. Yeah. All right. By the way, I like this command. Caffeinate. So if you don't want your computer to sleep, you can just type caffeinate in terminal, and it won't. A Mac combines the comfort of a good operating system with a full-fledged Unix power. It was easy to start using Node.js. At that time, it was around 0.10 version. And it worked fine for me. I used it with Browserify at that moment, later with Webpack, and it worked fine. But every time I wanted to share my code with somebody else, I had to supply complex instructions, like install this, verify that your Node.js version matches, use NVM, Node Version Manager, or some other tool, and inevitably my colleagues and other fellow developers on open source projects ran into problems. They were sending me messages saying that this doesn't work, and sometimes it was my fault. For example, I forgot to include a dependency that was installed on my machine, like or some command line tool I was using. I was used to using, and I forgot to mention it in my instructions. That was hindering the development process. And in a couple of years, Docker started to get traction. But before that, there was Vagrant, and it still exists. Vagrant is a great tool for bootstrapping virtual machines on your machine. So you write a configuration, and it creates a configured virtual machine for you. And it's a great tool, and it's very useful in certain circumstances. Docker cannot replace Vagrant or full-fledged virtual machines fully. but it was still inconvenient for me and my colleagues. Docker also appeared around that time, so I became interested in it. So around 3 years ago, I created my first Docker configuration and tried it out in a front-end project. It went well. It went surprisingly well. And I want to share my experience, my tips and tricks that I have discovered myself working with Docker. Your mileage may vary. Different projects require different configurations, but I just want to showcase what I have in store. I will also want to make a small live demo tonight. So I wrote a project template for you, and it's available on GitHub, and I'm going to use it on my computer to bootstrap a Next.js app and deploy it to Zeit now. It's a popular serverless hosting or engine. All right. So it looks like this. Well, I guess you're familiar with it. It's gaining traction in JavaScript world as well. And this is the repository with the code. And before I start, I wanted to tell you some more about the project. About my approach to the project. First of all, the easiest way to use Docker is to run one-time commands. You can specify an official Node.js image. You can pull it quickly from the Docker image repository and run a one-off command just like you would in an installed Node.js on your machine. So you would just run docker run node image spec, and then whatever you want to run. But this is not how we work in front end. We expect to have some long-running tools, like you would like to Webpack to watch your files and recompile them on the fly. You would like ESLint to watch your files and report any lint errors quickly. You might want to run your tests in watch mode. So to have this fast feedback loop when you're working on a project. I started researching this, and I came to a conclusion that I just need to drop into the terminal inside the container and have access to all the dependencies I need, and have those long-running process running inside Docker container on my machine, but isolated. For example, if I'm working, many times I'm juggling 3 or more projects in the same day. So I'm switching between projects. So I don't want to track which version of Node is activated or even installed on my machine. I just want to have a single command that would provide me with a complete development environment for this specific project. And it doesn't matter if it's some legacy project that still requires a Node 0.10 version, or if it's the latest and the greatest running on Node 12. I want to show you a configuration where I use my terminal to drop into container shells and run commands from there. So it sort of behaves like a virtual machine. Well, everyone knows that Dockers are not real virtual machines, but it feels kind of like that. And somebody might say Docker is insecure, you're doing it wrong, but I'm doing it locally on my machine. I have to compile my source code into some artifacts. So nowadays we have this compilation step practically everywhere in front-end development. So why not? If I can discard this development environment at the end of the day, if I'm not pushing it into production, then I'm golden. All right. So I have already cloned the project to my machine, and it includes files. Sounds nice. It includes files, right? The structure is basically looks basically like this. So when I go into my any real project now, I have the following files. So I have up command, down command, and attach, and then I have some configuration files, and what's important, this web folder where my source code lives. I could have placed the web code here, everything that I have in this web folder right here in the root of the project. But I did it like that to showcase that I might want to run additional Docker containers alongside my front-end development. For example, if I want to run a local database, a Postgres. It's very, very simple to do that with Docker. You don't have to install anything besides just you don't have to do anything besides specifying a single line in a Docker file. If anyone is familiar with the installation process of Postgres or Oracle database on your machine, that looks like magic. So you might want to have the entire infrastructure. And in this case, it might make sense to create another folder, call it DB, and put every file that relates to that into that folder. So this way you have this web container, DB container, Redis, GraphQL engine, anything you need to run alongside your main development. I'm going to start up command now. I deliberately cleared cache in my Docker so it doesn't have any images. This would look like on your machine. So it will take some time, and I will talk some more during the installation process. So I have the Docker for Mac running here. And now I can run my up command. And it will first it's building the Docker image from Node.js image from the official Node.js image from Docker. So it's downloading it, then it will install dependencies that I specified in a Docker file. And you might notice that I'm also installing Parallel and JQ. JQ is a JSON parser command line utility, very good, I recommend it. And Parallel is GNU Parallel utility that allows you to run any processes, scripts, or apps in parallel. I like to have them in my projects because you don't have to do everything in Node. There are a lot of very good tools. They just need to be available for you at the snap of a finger. And this is what Docker does for me. So in addition to Node.js, I also have JQ and Parallel, and I don't have to worry if my colleague has those on his machine or his or her machine, because Docker will install them inside the image automatically. And it will not pollute their computer, so it will install the right version, the version that we need, and at the same time, it will. Once we're done, you have a clean system, clean host system. So it's still downloading. And this is now it's starting to install things in the Docker image. It's pretty fast. So it's getting to the point where it will install JQ in parallel. I'm not using them in this project at all. I just wanted to illustrate that you can have third-party dependencies in your project. So it's creating it, and now it's installing all the node dependencies inside Docker. And this is where I'm going to my tips and tricks part. The hardest part for me was to make sure the Docker, this environment runs smoothly and is performant. Another nod to Krzysztof. Because many of you might know that any shared folders, we are going to share our project folder inside the Docker container to have access to the files. Well, any shared folders are slow by definition. They're like extremely slow because of the two-way communication with your host machine and the virtual machine. This is not as painful on a true Linux machine. So if you were running Ubuntu on your notebook, you would not notice that because Docker is not a virtual machine. It's a Unix group construct add-on. Well, I don't know the terms. Somebody might correct me in the Q&A section. But nevertheless, if you're using Windows for Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, you're essentially running Docker in a minimal virtual machine. I think it's called BusyBox or something. And this is where sharing your project folder becomes a bottleneck. It's extremely slow. And if Node.js requires node modules to be in your project folder. Compared to other systems, it's not typical. If you take Ruby, Ruby installs gems in another folder outside your project. Python also installs it outside your project folder. But Node.js requires that your local dependencies have to be inside your project folder. You can go with some shenanigans and install them into global Node.js node modules, but it's a real pain. I mean, I would rather wait. So I was solving this part for about 6 months. So I was trying one thing, another thing, and the solution I landed on is to use Docker volumes. You can define Docker volumes that are not shared folders shared with your host machine, but rather like buckets where you can put files and Docker would seamlessly mount them inside your container runtime. So I was able to do that, and then now it sounds simple, and it is really simple. I sim-linked the Node.js folder to that temporary folder in the volume, in the Docker volume, and that allows everything to run as fast as possible. So now Yarn has installed everything into that Node.js module, node modules folder in Docker volume. And you can see that the system dropped us into the Docker shell. I amended the shell prompt to signal that we're inside Docker. So it literally says Docker. And we're inside app. My folder is called my home dev and then Warsaw node in WarsawJS node in Docker. So this is where my files are. And here it's /app, but the files inside are the same. And here as well. So this app folder is shared. And you can see that the node modules folder is not a folder, but rather a symlink that goes to /mnt, tmp, and then node modules. And this particular part lives in a Docker volume. And that speeds up considerably, like 20x at least. So everything installed in there. Yarn, npm, pnpm respect symlink node modules, so they work seamlessly. You don't have to worry about that. And the reason I went with Yarn is because it's just the fastest in containers. When containers are ephemeral, you create and destroy them, and in this rapid development cycle, Yarn performs best. But it's up to you. It's your decide what's your personal preference. So I have installed. Docker has installed everything for me. So I have this command prompt, and now I can. Now I have some commands in my package JSON. Some scripts defined. So I have build, start, lint, watch, and dev. And I'm going to use yarn watch. This is what I would do if it was a real project and I was starting my day at work. So I'm typing yarn, run, watch. Here I would like to bring HiveMind into Spotlight. HiveMind is a process manager tool for development, similar to Foreman. If there are Rubyists here tonight, you might be familiar with Foreman. It's a tool for running your Rails projects, Sidekick, right? And other utilities side by side. And if any one of them fails, Foreman would stop everything else. So it's all or nothing. And it's a very good tool in development. Some might use it in production. So there's Foreman for Ruby, there's Honcho for Python, and recently HiveMind started getting traction. It's a Go, it's a process manager written in Go, and it's identical to Foreman, but it's a single file. You can carry it around on a flash drive. So here, what in my case, I have started Next.js. It's a Next.js framework project. I've started Next.js in development mode, those yellow lines. And at the same time, I started a lint watch process that watches my source files and outputs lint errors alongside Next.js. So I don't have to run lint command every time I change files. It does it for me. So let's go to the browser and see localhost. $3,000. And voila, this is a Next.js project boilerplate, and I just amended it to make it fancy for tonight. So let's edit it. Okay. Oh, all right. Sorry, I couldn't make Vim show different color scheme on the fly. All right, welcome to WarsawJS. All right, we're saving it. And you can see that our watch process reacted to the change, and our local preview has been updated. Let me show how lint errors pop up. For example, I'm going to violate my own rule not to use console calls. right. And we're switching back, and it's start latencing. Oh no, it didn't. Okay, once again. Well, it does recompiles, but obviously I forgot about this rule. Anyway, so it's linting, it is showing us the results. Wait, I know what to do. Let me define unused variable. This should trip it. Test. All right, voila. So the development, the feedback cycle is very fast. So I immediately get a notification that I have an unused variable. And there are a couple of more optimizations that I included in this project. So if you're curious, take a look at the lint.sh file because it allows you to selectively lint. Like if you're working on some files in a subdirectory, you might not want to run the lint process on the entire project because it will take around a minute or so in a reasonably big project. You want to get feedback as fast as possible on the file you're working on right now. So I have some accommodations for that in the watch lint script. Please take a look. So it updates, it works, and we have results. So let's try and publish it. So I mentioned Zeit HQ. Zeit now serverless hosting. It's very convenient. I like it, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. And usually to work with Zeit now or similar services like Heroku, you need to install their command line tool on your machine too. It's used for convenience. For example, you can type now, just 3 letters, and it will automatically deploy your project according to the configuration file. It's very seamless. It's pretty straightforward, but you have to have now installed on your machine, and you might forget it, or you might have the wrong version, or you for example, now has recently transitioned from a globally installed utility to a locally installed utility, and it's backwards incompatible. So I wanted to have now installed as part of this container setup, so that I don't have to install it on my machine. I guess it's a wet dream for every developer. So if you have a squeaky clean host system, and then you just pull out everything you need for the project out of the hat like a rabbit. Yes. So, and I'm coming close to it. So it's really working for me. So I have now installed as part of my package JSON. I'm using a token. The only thing you have to do is to define to provide the secret token as part of your configuration as in environment variable. I'm going to show it right now. Including the token. It's a security risk, but I'm going to revoke it after the talk. Maybe I won't, yeah. So in Docker, you can place any environment variables you want to be in your containers in a .env file like this. So I'm defining port 3000, I define Zeit secret token, and I define Zeit project name. Then I'm using it in my deployment script in package JSON. So this way, if I haven't shown you the secret token, it would stay on my machine. It's not, the env file is excluded from Git, so it's not added to the source code, to version history, and you're safe. And another developer, when they're booting up the development on or deploying, they can supply their own token. And this way, we don't have to share tokens. We just have to share the source. So here in the deployment command, I run yarn build, and then now with token name and production key. So I'm going to do it now. Yarn run deploy. And just before that, I want to show you that this project has no deployments. So this is the admin panel in my Zeit HQ account, and it doesn't have any deployments yet. And next is building the files, and then now we'll deploy them to the hosting, and we'll be able to view it on a remote domain already. And this is powerful stuff. All of those things I've shown you, I didn't have anything installed on this computer. And also, I'm working on another computer at home. So I have a Mac Mini with a huge monitor and a standing desk. And I work comfortably on Mac Mini. I use this machine rarely for events like this, or if I have to travel. So I usually don't have complete parity in installed utilities or apps on my notebook and on my desktop computer. And so you might think. You might imagine that I'm the consumer, just like my colleagues consume my configuration when I'm sharing my code with them, and vice versa. I am able to share the code with myself and configuration seamlessly when I'm switching machines. So nothing besides Docker was installed on this MacBook. So I just had to pull my Git repository and start working. And so I was able to deploy it relatively quickly, in around 10 minutes, if you subtract the token. So from zero to finish, I was able to deploy a real full-fledged Next.js app to hosting without installing anything. And voila, we have the deployment, and if we click on it, it has what we were working on. I could repeat that, but I think one deployment showcases it enough. So this is the fun part. This is the good parts. There are bad parts too. Well, you have to have Docker for Mac installed. And while my configurations work consistently on Mac machines and on Linux machines, I had variable results on Windows WSL systems. Windows Linux subsystem. There are caveats. Microsoft hasn't reached that point yet where you have everything as you would like to have. And another pretty big caveat. It might be a deal breaker for many developers now that we are using TypeScript more and more, and VS Code IntelliSense. Since to gain those to have those performance gains, I have placed all Node modules files into a Docker volume. And while it's perfectly accessible from the container and it works seamlessly, it mounts seamlessly, it's not available outside on my host machine. So my host machine sees just a symlink file just a symlink that goes nowhere because there's no /mnt tmp node modules on my host machine. And that really trips up IntelliSense, for example. It's getting better at it because now if you, in situations like this, VS Code would download the package from NPM itself. It would look up into your package JSON and download it and present the type definitions from that file, for example. But it doesn't work with your own node modules. For example, many developers have private packages that are not available on NPM, and this could be a deal breaker for you. Well, so far it has not been a deal breaker for our team because we're sticking to plain JavaScript for business reasons. And we are adopting Flow, Facebook Flow, in comment syntax, where you just add it to type definitions as comments to your JS code. And we're running Flow, of course, inside the container alongside lint utilities, testing, etc. And that's a good part too, because you don't have to switch Flow versions too. You have everything included. But in case of TypeScript and modern teams that work on TypeScript mostly, this might be a deal breaker. And I haven't found a solution for that, other than move everyone to Linux notebooks. So this was my demo. This was my story. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them right now and in the after.
Piotr, your question.
Hi, I'm not very knowledgeable about Docker, but so this might have slipped my attention, but is it possible to spin up a development environment with using Docker with one command, including front-end, back-end database and whatnot?
Yes, exactly. I'm doing just that on my project. And I decided not to include this information for brevity in my demo, but I also deploy those containers, multiple containers, as containers to Heroku container registry. So we are able to achieve complete parity. We have the same containers running in production. Yes, yes. For example, if you want to have Mongo or Redis or Postgres, either for testing, it works very well for testing because you can have ephemeral Postgres installations. Who wouldn't want that?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so my question is there, why would you deploy this on Heroku? If you have it Dockerized, you could use AWS, you could use Google Cloud. Why Heroku? Heroku is another layer over Amazon.
Well, people might think Heroku sponsors my work because I would say only good things about Heroku. As a business proposition, the way that you can transfer ownership of the completed app to your client, and we do client work mostly in our company, and this seamless transfer of ownership is unmatched in any other solution. I cannot imagine transfer ownership of a Kubernetes setup or a Docker Swarm setup or anything else. Even DigitalOcean droplets are hard to hand over. Yes. Heroku has its own limitations, and I'm fully aware of them. I like some of the solutions. For example, their file systems in the dynos are ephemeral, so any saved files just disappear after your dyno stops working, and it actually reinforces these 12-factor app development principles. But Heroku also limits us in many other way. But the business opportunity of quickly and seamlessly and effortlessly handing over the deliverables is the reason we pay big money for Heroku.
Well, that's very, very nice. You tell me this. Okay.
For personal projects, I would recommend Zeit, because deploying a full-fledged Next.js app is effortless as well.
Okay, so short question from me. You thought about deploying, but I would like also to ask question about development in the Docker image. So did you ever occur a problem with file changes watching inside your volume? Because I was struggling with that using the Node.js utility, but also hear from my friends which were starting with Docker about some troubles, and I'm thinking if it's weak point of Docker itself or about weakness of this utility.
Thank you for asking this question. This is one of the tips and tricks I simply didn't have time to share. Yes, I also researched and encountered those problems with file events watching. I suppose you had those issues on a Mac machine or a Windows machine, but because on Linux it's seamless. The file events are the same, they just propagate into your container setup. But file events are there is a different file event system in Mac. I think it's BSD based, because Mac is BSD based, and if I remember correctly, the Linux system is iNotify, but Mac uses the other one. And the event names and meanings do not map to each other directly. So in some cases, all file events propagate, but the Linux system that you're running in the Docker cannot interpret them, or rather the utility that's listening for them is not able to interpret those file events. So to keep it short, if you cannot find the solution, you will have to resort to polling, for example, in NodeMon, and just increase the polling interval from the default 100 milliseconds to around a second. Yes, it will be much slower, but in case of NodeMon, you're usually restarting the entire server, and it takes time. So this increased interval would serve as a debounce of a sorts. So it's not a big problem. Some watch utilities do not support polling and do not support Docker containers, but others do. And I would recommend WarsawJS. It's the name of the utility. It's a single word. It's called WarsawJS, and I have included it in my project template. In fact, I'm using it for watching the files for the LinkedIn utility. And it works seamlessly. They have a workaround. They have a special translation layer for those events. So it works even with Vim. Vim is notorious for triggering the wrong file events, or from the other utilities point of view.
Thank you for the tip, and you are right. I'm using Mac, so my friend was also using Mac, and probably this was the problem, this file system. Thank you.
On Linux, you won't have those problems, but you have trade-offs in other places.
Okay. Any more questions? Congratulations, Illarion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.